Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Policy Exchange Fringe, feeling the effects, tackling problem, drinking and crime. Also here tonight with the Wine and Spirits Trade Association. We're here to discuss binge drinking, antisocial behaviour, and the efforts and strategies to try and tackle that, from policing to licensing, and to the kind of responsibilities that the on-trade are taking on. We have with us, glad to say, Jeremy Browne, the Minister of State for Crime Prevention, who very ministerially arrived 5 minutes late, but we won't, I guess, we won't let him catch his breath. Max Chambers from Policy Exchange, who's on their Head of Crime and Justice. Willie Boyack, the Media and Public Affairs Manager of the Wine and Spirits Trade Association. And last but absolutely not least, Rennie, leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. So I'm just going to ask each speaker to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, after which I'll ask them some questions, and no doubt you'll want to ask them some questions as well. Sorry, I should have said I'm in advance political editor of the Scotsman. Now, over to William, if you would like to give a view from the point of view of the Wine and Spirits Trade Association. William.
Great, thank you, Eddie. And firstly, just apologies for my very croaky voice, which I assure you has nothing to do with the Glasgow weather. But yeah, I've just got a bit of a croaky voice, and apologies about that. Thanks everyone for coming as well. I think it's a very topical opportunity to talk about some of the issues around alcohol misuse, and also from the industry's perspective, what are some of the initiatives which we're putting forward to target alcohol misuse. I say it's a topical discussion because recently we've had the UK government respond to its alcohol strategy consultation, which the Minister was heavily involved with, and also we have the ongoing minimum unit pricing debate here in Scotland. Firstly, just to give you a little bit of context about, I suppose, the trends around alcohol misuse. I think it's important to point out that in the UK, we've seen a fall in consumption of 16% since 2004, and a 3.3% fall in consumption just last year. In Scotland, we've seen an 8% fall in consumption in the past 3 years, and around alcohol contributable crimes, we've seen I think it's a 16% fall in the UK between 2007 and 2011, and in Scotland we've seen a 25% fall in drunkenness offences since 2003. So they're quite significant falls in both consumption and alcohol attributable crimes, and that's a really positive trend. But at the same time, I think we could all agree that the costs associated with alcohol misuse are still far too high. So it's really important that as an industry we acknowledge that, and we certainly see ourselves as part of the solution going forward, and that's why the industry across the board, and I know we have representatives from beer industry and many of the retailers here today, are at the forefront of putting forward proposals and initiatives to tackle alcohol misuse. So given the context of the recent alcohol strategy response, I think it's worthwhile just to talk about some of the challenges that the government has given to the industry to take forward. Many of the initiatives which are working well, which there's been positive progress, but also where we can go further and do more. So I was just going to quickly mention, in the Scottish context, firstly, with the minimum unit pricing legal challenge, the Court of Session, the Outer House of Court of Session recently found in favour of the Scottish Government, and that's now been appealed and is likely to be appealed all the way to the European Court of Justice. Now, the Scottish Government had said that they wouldn't support a referral directly to the European Court of Justice. The Scotch Whisky Association would like to see a direct referral so that the process could be finalised as quickly as possible, and I'd be interested to hear the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats' view on whether they would support a direct referral to the European Court of Justice, because I think it's important that we do get a resolution around this issue as quickly as possible. I just wanted to look quickly as well at some of the initiatives that the industry is supportive of and which we would like to see further action on. The first of which is an enhanced public health responsibility deal. The industry has already collectively pledged to ensure that 80% of all products contain health labels with clear unit content and Chief Medical Officer guidelines by the end of 2013, and to remove 1 billion units from the market by the end of 2015. So these are quite significant pledges, and the UK government is currently in talks with the industry to build on the responsibility deal pledges. One such area, I think, which we could benefit from further exploration is a greater focus on street drinking. While this is a complex problem, as an industry we can and should be looking at innovative solutions to address such problems. In addition, the industry has also pledged to fund at arm's length education programs for children and young people, which would help them to safely navigate mixed messages about alcohol and other risks. The second area for further action is a focus on targeted local action, and this is a really important point. We have some areas, particularly around the northeast and obviously in Scotland, areas of high alcohol-related harm, and we need targeted solutions to deal with these problems. One of which is community alcohol partnerships, and the other is best bar none, which are prime examples of industry-led solutions that could be rolled out in the highest areas of harm. CAPS bring together local retailers, trading standards, schools and police to tackle underage drinking and associated antisocial behaviour in communities. And there are now over 50 operational CAPs in England, Wales and Scotland. The first fully fledged CAP was rolled out recently in East Edinburgh. The other initiative is Best Bar None, which is a national award scheme supported by the Home Office to promote responsible management of licensed premises. The scheme has now been adopted by over 100 towns and cities across the UK. In Doncaster, violent crime has fallen in the town centre during the evening by over 40%, and in Durham, violence is down by nearly 60%. And I should say, CAPS has seen a reduction of antisocial behaviour by 30% in Durham, 30% in Barnsley and 37% in Durham. So it's important to recognise the success of voluntary action and industry-led initiatives. The industry is in a really good position to go further in many areas than the government could simply by legislating. And one such example is through the Portman Group, which is the self-regulatory body for alcohol producers. It operates a strict code of practice to ensure that alcohol is marketed responsibly and doesn't appeal to children. And the recently updated code of practice prevents producers from using in any significant role images of people who are or look under the age of 25. Such rules can only be implemented by the industry itself, and are a good example of voluntary industry action going further than government regulation. A couple of other industry-led initiatives which I thought I'd quickly mention is Drink Aware, which is an industry independent charity supported by voluntary donations from across the drinks industry, which equips people with the knowledge to make decisions about how much they drink, provides accessible evidence-based information about alcohol and its effects to employers, young people, teachers, parents and community workers. Finally, I just thought I'd quickly mention one of the views which is very strong in the health community is that higher prices will lead to a reduction in consumption. And an important point I thought, which is an interesting development to people who hold that view, is that a recent review of the Sheffield University study which underpinned minimum unit pricing found that 45p minimum unit price, the predictions would be slashed by almost 2/3. So the original predictions of 45p minimum unit price were actually slashed by more than 2/3. And the interesting comparison there is that under the responsibility deal, the 1 billion unit pledge, to remove 1 billion units, consumption will fall by 2.7% or 19.2 units per drinker, which is a 51% higher reduction than a 45p minimum unit price was predicted to achieve. So I think that's a really important point to consider, and it shows that through voluntary action we can actually make further progress than excessive regulations. So in summary, partnership working is not the easy way out. Policies which target the root causes of problem drinking are the most effective way to reduce alcohol-related harm. This includes more and better education, better enforcement of existing regulations, and locally targeted solutions that deal with local problems. Cheers.
Okay, thanks. We have 7 minutes here on the naughty step.
Cheers.
Chair, can I just say something? He gave us a lot of information, stats, which we're all interested in. I could barely hear him. I know he's apologised for his voice, but he didn't even use the microphone.
Right. Okay, could I ask...
Just check if we can hear you.
Okay. Could I ask speakers to make sure that they have the microphone in there? Right. Anyway, Jeremy, would you like to go next? Jeremy Browne?
I have an extremely loud, booming voice, which
Yes,
often gets me into trouble. Although I have spoken at organisations of my constituency, often with people much older than yourself, who said, I didn't agree with anything you said, but I liked it a lot because you're the first speaker I've been able to hear for the last 2 years, and at least it felt it was worth turning up. So I will try and I'll try and be as project as much as possible, and you may or may not like the content. Let me raise a sort of few themes. Alcohol consumption is definitely a contributory factor to crime. You can have a long conversation about the degree to which it contributes, because different statisticians will categorise these things differently, and it's hard to know whether somebody who's been drinking would have committed the crime had they not been drinking, because obviously there's no way you can emphatically prove that. But particularly sort of violent disorder, particularly among young men, alcohol is often an aggravating factor. That's sort of intuitive. I think most people would accept that. I think it's also, beyond just crime, can create a sense of disorder and sort of anxiety for people. I see this in Taunton, which is the main town that I represent in Parliament, that there's nothing against the law to have a hen party of 12 women drunkenly walking down the street dressed up as nurses, but there are quite a lot of local residents, maybe slightly older residents, who feel that the normal rules of behaviour in their community have been suspended in a way that they find unsettling and makes them less inclined to go out maybe for a meal in the town centre in the evening, even though, as I say, that those people who've been drinking in those circumstances aren't actually committing a crime. So there is a wider sort of point about respect for other people in the community. Although it is, of course, true and worth pointing out, and was just pointed out then, that alcohol consumption overall is going down. That is quite counterintuitive, because I think most people reading the newspapers would assume that it's going up and that we've never had so much drunkenness as we do today. Although I remember when I went to university, coming up to 25 years ago now, the entire Freshers' Week was orientated around us all getting incredibly drunk every single night. And it was seen as somehow not entering into the spirit of things, not to conform to that type of behaviour. So there's a bit of a sort of talk as if this was a sort of phenomenon that's crept up after the last 5 or 10 years, and before that nobody ever drunk to excess. Although within those headline figures of falling alcohol consumption, it is perfectly possible to have problem drinkers and categories of problem drinkers, or geographic areas where problem drinking is particularly strong. So the headline figures don't necessarily tell the whole story. And crime has fallen very markedly as well. Again, if you read the newspapers, you might think that crime is increasing. Actually, crime is at its lowest point since the independent crime survey for England and Wales, the pattern conforms to this as well, was started in 1981. So we live in a country where people are consuming less alcohol and committing fewer crimes. And I just think it's worth sort of putting that on the record before addressing all of the issues around alcohol-related crime, which almost come from a sort of opposite premise to those which I've just outlined. And I suppose the government has a sort of multi-dimensional approach, and let me touch on that and then make a sort of final sort of observation. One of them is we want to give greater power to localities. I'm talking, sorry, I apologise for people in host country, but a lot of this, nearly all of this, applies to England and Wales because it's a devolved matter for Scotland. But within England and Wales, we have an active policy of seeking to give more power to local licensing authorities, and in practice councils, directly elected councils, to make decisions about what they think is the right mix within in their town centres, their communities, the nighttime economy. Have they got too many bars? Are they too close to each other? And we've brought some specific measures into place. They're very early stage. They haven't been widely adopted by councils, but they may come to be in time. One of them called an early morning restriction order, which gives councils greater power to restrict the licensing hours in sort of clusters of bars where there may be particular problems with what they see as a disorder caused by excessive drinking. One of them is so-called late night levy, which is the power that councils now have to put a levy on drinking establishments, licensed premises, which would raise only a modest amount of money, but that money could be used to, for example, clean the streets up of all of the things that people who are drunk on the way home have thrown around on the streets. Why should the argument goes, should the overall council taxpayer clear that mess up, when actually it's a byproduct of the industry that made a considerable amount of money selling drinks to all of the people who then walked home in a fairly drunken state and littered the streets. So that is the sort of thinking behind those sort of measures, to try and give some more power and some more opportunities to local licensing authorities. We are introducing a modest measure. I'll come back to minimum unit pricing in a moment. We're introducing a relatively modest measure compared to minimum unit alcohol pricing, which is a duty plus a VAT requirement. So you will not be able to sell alcohol for less than the tax that you pay on the alcohol. Now, I appreciate that's quite a sort of low threshold, but some places have been selling alcohol as an aggressive loss leader and writing off a small amount of losses. So you know, promotions around lager being sold with barbecues or whatever it might be, and that will not be permissible anymore at the most sort of, as I say, aggressive loss leader pricing range. And then we are working a lot with industry and a whole range of issues to do with labelling and public information. Industry have agreed to discontinue some products which were largely consumed by people who were drinking irresponsibly, either people who were drinking excessively on a one-off occasion, but with potential consequence in terms of disorder, or bluntly put, people who drank to excess on a daily basis. And then there are some other issues, I think, around which I think actually do provide quite a lot of good opportunities, things like glass sizes. And there is an issue where the default mode is to sell somebody a glass of white wine that has a third of a bottle of wine in it. You say, I only had 3 glasses of wine when I went out with my friends last night, i.e. you drank a bottle of white wine on your own. And whether people should at the very least be offered smaller glasses, or the default mode should be to sell a smaller glass unless the person specifically requests a bigger glass. And I think quite a lot of those areas are potentially quite productive. Let me finish though with this sort of observation. Government decided not to go ahead with minimum unit pricing in England and Wales, because the Scottish Government is looking to introduce a minimum unit price of 50p, and of course it's entirely up to them, subject to the decision of the courts whether they do it. But politically it's entirely up to the Scottish Government whether they wish to proceed down that path. The government covering England and Wales, the UK government with the remit of England and Wales, consulted on a 45p minimum unit price and decided not to proceed. And I think one of the reasons that the government decided not to proceed is an argument which is worth Liberals reflecting upon, which is the degree to which the state seeks to impose its preferences on individuals through pricing. And I think there is a wider Liberal issue in this whole area about industry doing things, about councils doing things, about central government doing things, but there is a personal responsibility dimension to it as well. And ultimately, people have to exercise some personal responsibility and have a degree of freedom to undertake activities which come down to the choices that they make. And I think there was some nervousness about the effects of minimum unit pricing. Bluntly put, that if you're a person who's reasonably well off, who drinks a bottle of Chablis at home every evening, it wouldn't make any difference to you. But if you're a person who is less well off, but you drink a bottle of Lambrini at home every evening, we would think it was in your own interest to make that £1.50 more expensive than it was before. In other words, it was a tax on the drinking patterns of poorer people that completely excluded middle-class people from its effects. And there's a lot of middle-class politicians who couldn't see what all the fuss was about. Well, it's because they don't buy bottles of wine that cost less than £4.20, £4.30, depends where you set the minimum unit price. So I can see the argument for minimum unit price, because undoubtedly there is a degree of price sensitivity in alcohol, although it doesn't necessarily quite conform to sort of supply and demand charts like a lot of products, because as you'll have observed, if you spot somebody, your ability to exercise necessarily very rational price judgments after you've had a certain number of drinks may diminish, but there is undoubtedly a price sensitivity in alcohol. But I think there are also issues about the social effects and about personal choice, and for those reasons the government decided to hold back in England and Wales on minimum unit pricing. But that doesn't mean we have an absence of an alcohol strategy. We are still proceeding on all of the grounds that I've just been running through.
Thank you very much indeed. The degree to which the state seeks to impose its preference on individuals. I hand over to Willie Rennie on that very issue. I hope you'll expand further. Without the English and Welsh now.
I appreciate the policy proposal in England and Wales was different to that in Scotland. I mean, in England and Wales, my understanding it was most based around kind of crime and antisocial behaviour and those issues, whereas it's more based around health in Scotland and the harm that causes. I too have considered this really carefully in terms of the Liberal perspective. And these are about the balance of freedoms, the balance of responsibility too. I think, however, the harm that excessive alcohol consumption is causing justifies an intervention and justifies a change. And that's why I shifted our party's position in Scotland from being against to being for. It was always fairly balanced, but I changed the position. I changed the position to be in favour. My dad was a grocer, and I remember when I was a boy, I used to work in the shop, and I remember the price of whiskey, not that I drank it when I was 15, but I remember the price of whiskey in the shop at that time, and it's not an awful lot higher, it's not an awful lot higher now than it was then. And actually, if you look at the figures are quite dramatic. I mean, the prices are up 22% in the last 30 years of drink. But incomes are up 97%. So actually, relative affordability is quite clear. And the consumption has gone up about 20 to 22% in those 30 years. And deaths have doubled. And there's also an increase in the number of admissions to hospitals and so on, health problems. So there's a quite clear, in my view, correlation between price, consumption and harm. And it's quite a dramatic connection. And I think therefore there's an obligation upon politicians to act in such circumstances. So I'm in favour of acting. It's not just about health though, there is antisocial behaviour issues. As an MP in Dunfermline, I was plagued by complaints from people who were concerned about, particularly young people, drinking excessively at weekends with very cheap buckfast. I don't know if anybody's experienced buckfast in Scotland. It's a particularly toxic combination of caffeine and alcohol, and it's called loopy juice in Scotland, which has the obvious effects on young people. It's not the only drink that causes problems, but other issues, cheap cider and other cheap alcohol is a big problem as well. So there's antisocial behaviour issues that we need to get to grips with as well. I suppose the final issue for me that's really critical in this is that a hell of a lot of people from the health lobby think this is justified action that we should take. And if you look at BMA, Alcohol Focus Scotland, the chief medical officers believe action should be taken. Tesco, of all people, believe that action should be taken there as well. So there's quite a substantial body of supporters of taking action. And education is easy to do. We always resort to doing education, knowledge, information, but it's the least effective form of action. The most effective form of action is direct action in terms of price. That's the correlation. Canada, where we've got minimum unit pricing, the recent evidence coming out there is that it has made a difference. It's had a significant impact on consumption, which therefore I think is further evidence in support. The argument that without minimum pricing, consumption has gone down in recent years probably is more connected to the recession than it actually is to anything else. The recession has obviously had an effect on relative affordability, and that's probably had an impact on consumption too. And I've seen a gradual increase in prices within supermarkets as well, perhaps in preparation for some of the measures that's been proposed or a reaction to the political initiatives that have been taken. The Sheffield study is quite authoritative. I know there's disputes about how authoritative it is, but these are serious academics who have got serious supporters. So I'm not an academic, but I have to base it on the people who support them, including a lot of the health charities and supporters of this initiative. So I think time is needed to take action on minimum pricing. And to be honest, I'm disappointed that the UK government didn't take the step, because I thought there was the will there, I thought there was the courage there. But I'm afraid it looks quite timid to back down on that measure. We can't just stand by while these things are happening. If deaths have doubled in 30 years, consumption has gone up to that dramatic effect, and we can see the close correlation to price, then I think we need to act on price and no longer allow drinks to be sold at such cheap levels and causing such harm. So I'm in favour of minimum pricing. I believe I'm probably a minority on this panel, but nevertheless I still support it because I think it's action that's long required.
Thank you very much, Willie. There's the two balanced views there. The two Lib Dems. I wonder if we could move on to lastly, our last speaker this evening is Max Chambers, who's the head of Crime and Justice at Policy Exchange. Max, thank you.
And can I say thanks again to WSTA for supporting the event. And it's nice to see so many of you cracking into the wine so enthusiastically as well. So probably just worth saying at the outset. Probably just worth saying at the outset again that the majority of people are responsible drinkers and can consume alcohol without harming themselves or wider society. Also probably worth saying that the alcohol industry is worth over £40 billion to the UK, and a profitable alcohol industry is important for UK PLC. And in moderation, alcohol is an important part of the social fabric of the country as well. But clearly there's a problem with a pretty sizable minority of hardcore drinkers. So just over 1 million people have a level of alcohol dependency in the UK, which I was quite shocked by in reading up for this event. And clearly millions of people binge drink on a regular basis as well, which is causes a whole range of problems for policing and health services. And on various measures, things in the UK are pointing in the wrong direction. So, for example, rates of liver disease are going up, whereas in other parts of the EU they're coming down. And also hospital admissions have been ticking up for a long time as well, and in other parts of the EU they're going down. We've got roughly 1.2 million hospital admissions a year. But it's not just a health problem, so my work at Policy Exchange is primarily concerned with crime policy. And in England and Wales, 44% of violent incidents in England and Wales, the perpetrator is drunk or perceived to be drunk. And in Scotland, it's 72%. So it's a huge issue in this country. Half of domestic violence incidents involve alcohol, perhaps unsurprisingly, and when violence occurs where alcohol is present, far more likely to see serious wounding or serious injury as well. So given all of that, the policy exchange perspective is that it's really important that we have an approach that properly targets that hardcore, while making sure that policy doesn't unnecessarily penalise responsible drinkers for the sale by the majority. So we think the government's alcohol strategy in broad terms is a real step forward, published last year, particularly the steps to tackle cheap booze, irresponsible promotions, and some of the steps to challenge individuals to change their behaviour as well. Our view on MEP is that it was probably a public health solution to what was primarily a political problem around binge drinking and the nighttime economy and crime. So although it's disputed, it may well have led to a marginal reduction in overall population consumption, but actually there isn't a huge amount of evidence that I've seen that it would have addressed what the Prime Minister called in the forward to the strategy, the scourge of violence caused by binge drinking. I'm not sure it would have actually impacted on that. So 3 quick ideas that one that we've suggested, and 2 that we're examining at the moment that would tackle that hardcore. So one is developing the idea of the late night levy, but making it even more targeted at premises that are driving police and emergency services demand. So you've got the late night levy on the one hand, and then the other end of the scale is actually taking away people's licences, which doesn't happen very often. So what about a levy that was actually targeted and increased for those premises that are seeing police call-outs and ambulance call-outs? Second idea, which we suggested a few years ago, is charging, probably quite controversial, but charging people the full NHS tariff cost of their admission to A&E. So this is a 1.2 million a year. If people were hit with a £532 fine for the cost of that admission to taxpayers, maybe that would make them think twice about their behaviour. We suggested as well that that be discounted quite heavily if they accept a brief intervention, which have been proven to change behaviour as well. And a third suggestion, I've just been out in the US visiting sobriety schemes over there in Washington and Pennsylvania and Michigan. And over there, the courts can order a period of sobriety, tends to be between 90 and 120 days, backed up with an ankle bracelet that measures your alcohol consumption. I've worn one for a week, and it's very accurate. The stats are incredible for how effective that can be in both reducing people's consumption, but also reducing recidivism as well. So they're 3 ideas from me.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Max. Well, immediately I feel I want to ask both politicians whether they're going to charge NHS tariff costs to people who have to drinkers. But just well, just to summarise, I think we had a blizzard of statistics and facts thrown at us there, some very contrasting views as well. Particularly, I thought on the impact of price on this problem, and also on the question of legislation, whether is legislation needed, or is it a question of changing behaviours and how about doing that. Without further ado, I have some questions to ask, but first of all, maybe I can ask people to ask questions themselves. When you're asking a question, could you please say who you are and where you're from?
Campbell and Scotch Whisky Association. I'm not going to debate the statistics with Willie because we've had a discussion. The one question, and we'll agree to disagree on minimum pricing. The one question I would ask, you raised Buckfast, for example, which isn't going to be hit by minimum pricing. So if that's a problem, what would you bring forward as a solution to that?
It was a mistake to mention Buckfast.
That's what
I like the term loopy juice, so I wanted to refer to it. But the main problem is other drinks which are far cheaper and would be affected by it. You can be cheap vodkas and so on. So that to me is the major impact on them. I actually think also in terms of Buckfast, what I've encouraged shops to do is to actually just not stock it anymore. And some of the more responsible Spa in parts of my constituency were doing that because it was so much trouble was caused by selling that drink to their community, that they stopped selling it and they reduced the crime around their shop quite significantly. So actually, retailers have got personal responsibility as well. They can't just simply think it's somebody else's problem. So I think they should do that. The other issue that I think we need to do is to crack down on adults who buy for kids. The kids who hang around the shop. Adults should actually be prosecuted. And I don't hear often enough of adults getting prosecuted for that. And I think they should. Because the kids hang around the shop, they plague the adults when you go in. The adult thinks they're doing the kid a favour, and they're not, and they should be prosecuted for doing so.
Any other comments like to come in? No. I'll leave there.
Karen Stevens, Police Federation of England and Wales. This is for Max really. I like the 3 ideas that you've come up with at the end, but the fact that we've lost 14,000 police officers in the last couple of years because of the cuts, how do you expect there to be police officers to answer these calls in the late night levies? Because even though they might be paying for them, there aren't police officers there, and the ones that are there are also covering for ambulance services because the ambulances are not turning out to these things. Also, you say about charging for the cost of health admission. You've all kind of agreed that a lot of people who have got these problems on the lower income, at the end of the day, we're going to be the ones that have to pay for that because they haven't got the money. So it'll be out their benefits that we're paying for it. So we'll be paying for it double, I would have thought.
Okay. Well, on police numbers, obviously, it's a separate debate about.
But you're bringing in these ideas for it.
Yeah.
So.
I think the point of the late night levy is actually to make sure that the licensed premises bear the cost of policing more directly. So actually, I think that sort of deals with your point. And if we're talking about increasing revenue, increasing charges against particular problem premises and therefore increasing overall revenue, then I think that addresses some of the issues around whether the police have enough resources. But on the second point, I'd say, well, taxpayers are paying now for the NHS, treatment that these people are receiving. So we can either pay through the NHS or we can pay through the benefit system. We pay at the moment. You can make that argument about having court-ordered fines or court-ordered compensation orders, and I don't hear anybody saying that we should abolish fines or compensation orders. So I'm not sure I agree with either point.
But we are still paying twice from them, aren't we, if it goes through the cost of it?
We are, but you can't tell me that 1.2 million people, that there aren't a significant portion of those people who could pay the £500 fine.
People who are alcoholics should be treated as alcoholics who've got a health problem.
Medical problems.
And actually, I think it's a different issue, I think, from the kind of binge drinking issue which causes antisocial behaviour. So if people are going in and they've got alcoholism and they're going in, I don't think they should be charged at all. They need help. They don't need to be charged for it. So I agree with you on that front.
Some of them are just going in to have their stomach pumped. Some of them are 17, they're not alcoholics.
So that's the big
Can I just want to deal with this issue about this is only a minor problem for a lot of people who just binge drink. We all drink too much. Actually, the amount that we're all drinking, we all just have a glass of wine instead of a cup of coffee when we come home at night, often. And the general increase in consumption by the general population has increased substantially over time. So it's not just an issue. That's not the antisocial behaviour issue, that's the health issue. But we shouldn't just think this is a minority of people that we're dealing with here. It's the majority of people who are drinking too much.
Gentlemen.
I'm Jonathan Shear from Wave Trust, and I'd appreciate if all the panelists would speak to the issue that has not been heard from any, and that's the issue of the impact upon children. And I'm thinking of the impact in terms of fetal alcohol harm, which causes irreversible brain and nervous system damage. Where's the liberty issue in that for the children whose lives are ruined before they ever take a breath? And it's an issue in child abuse, where parents drinking leads to violence against children. It's an issue of child maltreatment when parental drinking or societal drinking means that children witness violence, begin to see violence as normal, experience that as part of their home life. And it's part of children's lives when that's what adults role model for them and socialize them into a way of understanding and treating alcohol that's injurious to their lives and futures. And yet, the impact on children tends to be overlooked repeatedly.
Jeremy, would you like to?
Well, I agree with all of your observations. I mean, and everyone on the panel may wish to contribute, but they're all harrowing examples, and clearly we need to try and discourage people as much as possible from behaving in a way as the detriment of children, of fetuses in the case of children in the womb. I hope that the sort of counter to your concern a bit is actually there may be a wider public awareness. I think there's quite a lot of people, or women in this case, who may drink on a regular basis, who then stop drinking during the duration of their pregnancy or cut back dramatically on their drinking, possibly to a greater extent, I haven't seen the actual figures, than would have been the case a generation or two ago. Anecdotally, that seems quite likely to me, that a lot more people are conscious of these issues, but I take your point about the severe harm that's caused in some cases. I think there is a sort of wider, two wider points very quickly. One is there is a wider problem of alcohol in society, and I agree with Willie and others on this point. And you just sort of see it in terms of, when the England cricket team won the Ashes for the first time in 18 years in 2005, they all, or most of them, Andrew Flintoff most probably, stayed up all night. And when they went to the reception at 10 Downing Street, he was so drunk he could hardly stand up. It's quite hard to believe that sports people in other countries, or all other countries, would assume that before they were going to go see the head of government, they would go on an all-night bender. And a lot of people thought that that was just, a lot of people think that that is, you finish, I'm making a sort of celebrity example, but a lot of people, the norm, you finish your exams or something, the expectation is you will just go sort of drinking for hours and hours and hours and hours. A great night out is drinking for hours and hours and hours and hours. And that is a manifestation of a wider attitude towards alcohol in society, which at its more extreme manifestation causes a lot of the social harms that we are talking about. And my sort of second related point is this, which is that always the dilemma for liberals and for policymakers is the degree to which you penalise people as a whole to try and prevent behaviour that is perpetrated by a minority, or you try and protect a minority from the consequences of their own bad decisions by penalising people as a whole. And that is there isn't an emphatic right or wrong answer. I tend to err on the side of that we shouldn't penalise the majority for the bad decisions of a minority. And I suppose on minimum unit pricing, Willie may err on the other side. I think they are both legitimate points of view. The question is the tension between them and where you draw that line. And of course that is what we're probing this evening.
William, the gentleman was asking the point about the effect on children, and how can the drinks industry do anything here?
It's a good question, and just a couple of quick points. One really important thing that the industry is already doing is through the labelling pledges to ensure that by the end of this year, 80% of all products include health labelling, and part of that commitment is to include a warning that pregnant women shouldn't drink. So that's an important step, I think. And also, I know that Diageo is putting a huge amount of funding into this area. So I think that's two steps, but it is an important question, and I think the more we can do,
Does that satisfy you?
I think what it ignores is the reality that, two realities that aren't getting mentioned. One is that it is not extreme behavior which causes the problem. For example, women who drink before they know they're pregnant, before the first booking at 10 weeks, are still exposing that child to the potential risk, not a guarantee, but a risk of fetal alcohol harm. And that's not from just binge drinking, that's from normal drinking. And so the extent to which this is not about targeting alcoholics, It is about a broader societal consumption pattern which has an impact that we don't want to acknowledge fully. That's the first point. Second point is, this is not strictly a women's issue. This is about men as well, who have, in all kinds of ways, the effect of driving women to drink in these instances.
We've only got 10 minutes left, so let's just rattle through some quick questions. So,
yeah, just to pose the question, I don't know the answer to this, as to what the extent the extended opening hours have had, and they've had them for a number of years now, which has that had an impact on crime with regards to drinking?
should we take another quick question? See if anybody else. Yes, sir.
Do you think the Labour Party is endless legislating for trying to stop people to drink through like drinking banning orders and alcohol disorders, and actually had any tangible reduction in binge drinking crime?
So, right, two issues there. One is hours, and one is the kind of antisocial behaviour of attempt. Have they had any effect? Do you have any stats on this?
I haven't seen definitive stats. I mean, it's quite difficult. It might have mixed effects. There was a problem when nearly all places were licensed at 11 in the evening and they all closed at 20 past 11, that you'd get lots of people who are inclined to fight each other all on the streets at the same time. But of course you have a sort of more drawn out opportunity to drink now, although it is possible that people will drink more but be less inclined to fight each other. And then you have to say whether, you know, the health harms may go up and the crime harms may go down, and that's not necessarily sort of incompatible. And I think there is a sort of the reason this is quite a sort of difficult liberal issue is that I'm sort of nervous about how much the state encroaches on people. I understand all the points that are made, but you know, you go to our conference bar at 20 past 11 tonight. And there are quite a lot of people there who are exercising a personal choice, which is to continue to drink after what used to be the licensing hours. And I even venture that some people at Lib Dem Conference may drink more than the recommended 3 units for women and 4 units for men a day this evening. 2 and 3. Well, pint and a half for men. So if you see anyone drink more than a pint and a half, you should maybe you should take them to task. The one maybe is, how much should I, as a legislator or a minister, try and use a sort of heavy-handed central government approach to price out, or in other ways restrict, the people who will be in the Crown Plaza bar this evening? Or are they making a decision about how they wish to spend their time and their money, and who they wish to engage with and how they wish to do it, which isn't necessarily my role as a liberal? And there may be some consequences for them. But is that a decision that they should be making? And you may have some responsible drinkers. You may have people who drink very cheap alcohol. They might buy a very cheap bottle of spirits and then drink it in moderation over the course of 2 months. And is there a good reason why we should be increasing the price that they pay for that? So I think there are some quite big issues of liberalism. We should be a bit cautious, in my view, about reaching for sort of, I see it, sort of slightly heavy-handed status solutions to restrict people's personal choices.
Willie's just going to come very quickly back onto that.
That's almost an argument against banning alcohol, rather than actually trying to redress the balance of prices that have effectively been slashed over the last 30 years. I think what we're trying to do is to put right what has gone wrong in that period, and it's had the effect. So I'm not in favour of banning. I'm in favour of people having the choice to drink if they want to. But let's recognise the harm that's been caused as a result of the increase in consumption, as a result of the price.
Thanks, Willie. Gentleman at the back.
Yeah, I was delighted.
You say where you're from, sir?
Ewan Moyle from Glasgow South. I was delighted when Willie changed the Liberal Democrat policy on minimum unit pricing. I was equally disappointed when the UK government went back on it. I mean, the truth is that the groups in society who most enthusiastically embrace cheap alcohol are alcoholics and children. And certainly I've done research academically that suggests or indicates really quite strongly that the major determinant of whether children drink and get into a wide variety of problems with drink is how much expendable income they have. So essentially, if you make alcohol more expensive, children are less likely to develop a problem with alcohol. The other key thing I think Willie raised, Buckfast, I'm very concerned about the level of caffeine and alcohol. In America, they had drinks like Four Loko that suddenly came into the market and were marketed to children that had very high levels of caffeine and alcohol and created a hell of a lot of social harms. And they were immediately banned, well, banned very, very quickly. In Buckfast, it's more kind of crept up because it hasn't been marketed to children, it's just been a word of mouth, and they've enjoyed the effect. And it just allows them to keep going all night and not realise how drunk they are, so they just go in. But
Okay.
yeah, I think caffeine and minimum unit pricing.
And the chap next to him?
Yeah, Galen Mills, still in Liberal Democrats. I'm old enough to remember the Decker shop at Willie, Rennie's parents had, where they were really the only place that you could really buy a bottle at New Year, excluding the local pub. Now, binge drinking, and I have 2 daughters, so I know they get basically a high level of alcohol in before they leave their flat. You know, so who's selling them that alcohol? Yeah, it is the supermarkets. And in my day, there were no supermarkets. So, you know, you're trying to shut the door after the horse is bolted. If you don't tackle the sources of these cheap, you know, babies, and, you know, the number of pubs that have closed, you know, my local village used to have a pub. And if you got a bit OTT in the pub, you were told, you know, you're not getting any more drink tonight, sonny boy. You know, so the responsibility and the control through supermarkets has you know, been lost.
I don't necessarily disagree. I sort of feel I'm slightly sort of setting myself up to sort of, you know, offer one side of the debate, but maybe that makes the debate a bit more interesting. I just wonder whether it's a bit more complex than that. I mean, I just observe that that in Spain or other southern European countries where alcohol is much cheaper than it is here, people binge drink much less. Whereas in Scandinavian countries where it's much more expensive than it is here, people seem to binge drink quite a lot. And I'm not convinced that it is as price reliant as people sometimes think. I think there are quite bigger factors in play about social attitudes and also about the nature of disposable income. And there's a lot of, for example, young people in my constituency, older people sometimes say, well, when I was their age, I couldn't afford to buy more than a pint or two. But the difference is when they were their age, in their early 20s, they might have been married, had 2 children and a mortgage.
Yes.
Whereas there are people in my constituency in their early 20s who still live at home with their parents. They work full time, but their parents don't charge them any rent. They pay all the bills, they give them all the food, and they think of the money they earn, which may not be very much money, almost as pocket money to be spent on going out and buying clothes. So they have a very high disposable income, probably higher disposable income than their parents do in terms of luxury goods. And and they see it as a sort of social release mechanism to go and get very drunk with their friends. I'm just not sure that putting an extra 10p on a pint or whatever is really getting to the nub of what it is that makes them behave in that way.
If it's not price, then did you move to kind of ban loss leading and insist that they have to sell a duty plus part?
Well, I think there is quite a strong competition argument. It's a completely separate point, which is I'm generally in favour of people not selling products below the cost of the products, even less just the tax they pay on those products, because I think it's unfair on in competition terms. But it was seen. It's a very easy level to set because you can determine it fairly easily, and that was the policy the government arrived at. But so that's the position we're in.
Eddie's right. I mean, the state does intervene in all sorts of things all the time. It's the degree that we want to go to is the issue. How far do you want to go along that path? In my view, there is an issue about more northern countries drinking more. And that seems to be a pattern. However that has come about, that seems to be the pattern. And so we can't really compare ourselves with Spain or with the Scandinavian countries in that respect. We have to deal with what we've got here. And what's happened over time is there has been an increase in consumption and a reduction in the price. So to me, that's the action we need to take. Now, if it doesn't work, and I'm sure this is not the whole answer to it, if it doesn't work, you can try something else. But the situation, deaths have doubled. Deaths have doubled. This is a serious issue. Harm has increased dramatically. We can't just sit and just expect education to solve this problem. I don't think it will. So we need to take much more serious action, in my opinion.
Okay,
Can
we
I
are...
just make a quick
Sorry, go on.
point on that? I think one of the key things we're missing is that those that drink to the most harmful excess are the least likely to change their habit from price increases. And it's also, I think, very unfair to point the finger at retailers because I know that they sell alcohol very responsibly, they take their commitments very seriously. It was supermarkets who were behind the introduction of charge 25. And the other quick point is that if price was the answer, the UK already has some of the highest prices on alcohol through excise duty. So I think we're sort of missing a trick where we go back to the idea that price is the underlying factor behind why people drink to excess. So we need to look at some of the other initiatives which are already having progress and see how we can beef those up. And as the Minister said, some of those issues, the industry's been challenged to go further on, and that's something that we're committed to doing.
Okay, it is past 7:30, so we have one last killer question. No pressure.
I always find it a little odd when we talk about alcohol and crime and we don't talk about drug use, because they're often used comorbidly, and particularly amongst the groups we're talking about who are chaotic drinkers and possibly also drug users. So I was interested to hear that Max had been to Washington. Was that Washington State? And I think Jeremy's been on a fact-finding mission at the behest of the Home Secretary and the Home Office this year.
Not to what? I'm going there the week after next.
Oh, okay. I've got
During Tory conference, I thought I'd get away from it.
What I wanted
One side of the world.
the panel to talk about was whether or not experiences from speaking to other countries with perhaps different approaches to legislating and administering drug use, and how that was affecting patterns of alcohol consumption they were seeing in crime. You asked for a killer question.
I wasn't
Okay, so we did see a number of drug courts as well, and I've seen drug courts in the past. It's quite different in the US because they obviously start from a position where people can be in prison for drug possession, which is contrary to popular belief is not something that we tend to do in the Wales very much. One thing that is very impressive, and this is something you see in the sobriety courts as well, is the way in which the judge and the agencies, the probation, health services, social services, really corral around the individual and really try and solve the problems that are driving the offending, which is something that we've tried to do over here with drug courts, but I think we did a study on this about 4 years ago, has been implemented in quite a superficial way. And there are all sorts of reasons to do with the magistracy and lack of training that drives some of that. This is all a way of not really answering the question. I suppose we haven't yet come up with either a sentencing option or a social policy option that properly deals with those dual diagnosis and the interaction with mental health as well. But it's something that we're looking at, and we will be coming out with a paper on court reform and problem-solving justice in the autumn, so watch this space.
Okay. It's interesting, the European country that has the highest rates of persistent cannabis consumption among young people is Spain, which I just cited as an example where young people don't drink very much. So there may be a sort of displacement. Southern European countries have a higher, I don't know whether on total cannabis consumed per year, it's higher, but in terms of people who smoke cannabis at least 4 times a week, or whatever the criteria, i.e. measuring regularity, it's almost the opposite, interestingly, the alcohol one. There's a south-north divide with more consumed in the south. And smoking generally, actually, is very high numbers of Greeks smoke, for example, but they tend to have less problem with chronic drinking. There is an issue about combinations of drugs and alcohol. And it's becoming quite an interesting issue, interesting is not the dispassionate word, but with a lot more sort of increase in sort of legal highs and club drugs and a sort of drug consumption being a sort of aid to a sort of night out and people taking them in combination and sometimes suffering iller effects as a result of that. But a lot of the sort of problem drinking, whether it's people drinking on their own at home, just sort of getting through a bottle and a half of wine a day in sort of sips, or whether it's groups of people going out and drinking 10 pints on a Saturday night, is not directly associated with drugs. In other words, a lot of people who wouldn't dream of taking drugs, but will still take a legal drug, alcohol, in excessive quantities. So it's a rather roundabout way of saying that some people do and some people don't.
Great. Well, with that, I think we'll sum up. Just to say thank you very much to all our panellists. Thank you to the Policy Exchange. Thank you to the Wine and Spirits Trade Association. If nothing else, I think we've learned that the Liberal Democrats is a broad church. And I hope to see many of you supping your orange juices later in the night. Thanks very much.